Hi, everyone. In this episode, we are going to look at a topic, a question actually raised by Tertullian in 207 AD when he confronted a Paul only movement, where Paul was supposedly the only apostle, and the 12 were now with the bad God in Sheol, and Paul alone would be in heaven with the good God and with the good Jesus. The question Tertullian asked: did Jesus fail to plan things right before his ascension, and needed to enlist an enemy and a blasphemer? That's Paul. And Paul admits that in 1 Timothy 1:13. Paul will claim that he's received mercy, but Jesus says that is not possible. There is no pardon once you've committed a blasphemy. There's no sin of ignorance in this regard. It's you've insulted the Holy Spirit. You are damned forever, unpardonable. And if you say you don't think so, well, look at the context in which Jesus said that. It's these Pharisees who said Jesus had done his miracles by Beelzebub. And Jesus said, you may not have realized this, but you just insulted the Holy Spirit. So you now will be going to hell forever. He said, you've committed the unpardonable sin. They didn't know they were doing that. They thought they were just insulting Jesus. But that's why you have to be careful. You cannot, people can use the name of God and use it with power, and because the name of God has power, and they can actually heal people even though they don't know the Holy Spirit and don't know God. You go, wait a minute, where's that? That's in Matthew 7, verses 21 to 23, because Jesus says there's many who will do miracles in my name and mighty wonders and healings and all that, but I will tell them I never knew you, because you teach anomia, which is apostasy, according to the translation of Isaiah 1, verse 5 of that word into Greek. Anyway, let's look here at the right. We have a Blue Letter Bible that gives you a chronology. You can see that the death and ascension of Jesus is in 30 AD, according to this reference. Paul, in 34 AD, 4 years later, allegedly is converted on the road to Damascus, supposedly meeting the real Jesus, but we know that can't be Jesus. Why? Matthew chapter 24, verses 5 and 21 to 27 says, Jesus says, once I ascend, I'm not coming back in any private place, wilderness road, or anything like that. And don't listen to anybody who says they met me in that place, and somebody said I am the Christ, and they used my name. Do not believe that person really met me, because when I return, every eye will see me. And this is the verse that no Christian wants to face. And if you bring it up, they go, there has to be an explanation. There is none, and that's why none is ever offered. So anyway, so we should know just from that alone that Paul's false. But here's what Tertullian's doing. He's not even looking at that. Well, actually, he does look at that verse. I should go back and tell you. He's going to look at that verse in this quotation series, and he's going to say something about that. But regardless, he's going to test Paul by logic. He's an attorney, and he's the leading voice of Christian orthodoxy at this time, and that's important. He's written numerous books. He's the most voluminous of all authors, and his works have survived through all history. And this is his question: did Jesus fail to plan things right before ascension and need to enlist an enemy and a blasphemer, one claiming to receive mercy? So why would Jesus have had to do this? Was he forced or compelled to do this? And he says he's questioning and doubting that Paul could have been an apostle of Jesus Christ. And he later concludes there's absolutely no basis to say he's an apostle of Jesus Christ. Okay, so let's begin our episode here. By the way, Tertullian is a African from North Africa, and he was likely a black man. So one of the things that is always obscured in history is one of the greatest leaders of Christianity from the very beginning was a black man. So any of you people who are ethnic ethnic Africans by your origin, you can take some pride in this man. So anyway, let's take a look. Now, what I'm going to do in order to present this, I'm actually going to go back to my book, Jesus Words Only. It's free online to read. Here's the link, and it will provide you the entire thing in HTML. And don't go buy it online. Please don't do that. And we will present it this way because this is one of his arguments is, did Jesus really have to do this like out of compulsion because he failed to plan things out better with the 12? And the answer is obviously not. Jesus knows the future. He would not have made this mistake. It requires you to think he would make a mistake to actually have not finished appointing the apostles he wanted to be his apostles before he left. especially since he said, I'm not going to return in person. He can't pick somebody by coming down and picking him on a road to Damascus. So it's ruled out, but Tertullian doesn't go that far. But we'll see what he does say, though. Gets close. Okay, so we're going to begin reading from chapter 16 in my work, Jesus' Words Only. Tertullian, 207 AD, says Paul is inferior. In the period after the apostles from 125 to 325 AD, Paul's views on salvation were held in very low esteem by the orthodox leaders of Christianity. It is true we can find Paul is cited as an authority by the early leaders such as Tertullian, Origen, and so on. We even can find some leaders such as Polycarp were effusive, calling Paul glorious, yet they never expressly say Paul is a prophet. They never say Paul has specific prophecies that would put him on par with Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, or Jesus, nor do they ever teach Paul's faith alone, i.e., without works gospel doctrine, and that was a valid test for salvation. You will not find that in the early church pre-300. The early church always found a way to fit Paul into what Jesus says as recorded by the 12. In fact, Tertullian, a well-respected Christian lawyer and apologist for the faith, wrote in 207 AD against Marcion. This work was to attack the rising influence of Marcion. The Marcionites, beginning about 144 AD, claimed that only Paul had the true gospel. Marcion claimed the books of Matthew, Mark, and John contradicted Paul's gospel. Marcion only accepted a shortened version of Luke's gospel as valid. As a result of Marcionism, the issue of Paul's level of authority had to be resolved by the apostolic churches. The apostolic church had to answer whether Marcion's emphasis on Paul was valid. Let me just mention, apostolic church, is the successive origin of the original church. That would be an apostolic origin, leads to what we're seeing in Carthage under Tertullian. In response, Tertullian in 207 AD made several points in against Marcion, his book, that clearly reduced Paul to a completely marginal figure. First, as discussed below, Tertullian proves that Paul is inferior to the 12 apostles. Paul had to submit to their authority in Acts chapter 15. Second, Tertullian said there is no evidence other than Paul's own words that Jesus made Paul an apostle. Luke's account in Acts omits any evidence for this key claim of Paul that he was an apostle of Jesus Christ. Lastly, one by one, Tertullian tears apart Marcion's doctrines of total depravity, predestination, salvation by faith alone, and eternal security. On this second cluster of issues, Tertullian never identifies what verses in Paul that Marcion is citing. However, we all know what they were. We can hear in Tertullian's paraphrases of Marcion's ideas the ring of Paul's doctrine. Tertullian is silent on where these specific ideas of Marcion derive, but they are all too familiar to us. But first, let's provide a little more background on Marcion and the rival church system he founded. Here was the first splinter group within Christianity. Background on Marcionism. In 144 AD, one particular ex-bishop of the church named Marcion proclaimed three core teachings. Salvation by faith alone, and his words are, in his work, The Antitheses, the good, meaning the good God of the New Testament, redeems those who believe in him, but he does not judge those who are disobedient to him. So you can never go to hell for disobedience, according to Marcion. I need to put a little quote here. There we go. Wait. The law was not given by God the Father and could be disregarded. That's right out of Galatians 3:19. And Jesus did not come in sinful human flesh, but only appeared to have a body of human flesh. That's right out of Romans and I think it's Galatians. We'll see that in a second here. Philippians 2:7. Marcion relied upon Paul exclusively for doctrine. He rejected any of the Gospels written by the 12 apostles. Marcion claimed they were written solely for Jews. In a sense, he was simultaneously dispensationalist and sola scriptura. His claim that Paul only had the correct gospel dispensation allowed Marcion to shuffle aside any of the apostles, the 12 apostles' writings, as unimportant if they did not match Paul's gospel, which they don't. We have seen previously that Paul indeed taught salvation by faith alone, Romans 4, verse 4, Ephesians 2, verses 8 to 9. Even unrepentant, disobedient Christians committing incest are saved. That's in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 5. The law of Moses was given to Moses by angels who are not gods and weak and beggarly celestial beings. No obedience to the law was therefore necessary. Galatians 3, verse 17. verses 19 to 29, and Galatians 4, verses 8 to 9. Jesus only appeared to come in sinful human flesh, Romans 8, verse 3, and Jesus only appeared to be a man, Philippians 2, verse 7. Yet, despite Paul teaching the three core teachings of Marcion, Marcion was rejected universally by the post-apostolic church leaders. So think about that. If Marcion is teaching the same thing Paul's teaching, why would the church reject it when they all head off towards Marcion's vision of Christ, right? Marcion was a serious threat to the survival of Christianity. Marcion had created a church system with many churches. Marcionite churches had bishops and teachers. Marcion's church was in almost every land and community. Some believers in certain cities, they said there were more Marcionites than Orthodox Christians. The Encyclopedia Britannica, in its article Marcion, reflects this understanding. Quote, it says this: the Marcionite sect, highly ascetic and celibate, grew rapidly until it was second in strength only to the original church. It had churches and an episcopal hierarchy and practiced the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. Marcion rejected the Old Testament and almost all of the New Testament, basing his teachings on 10 of the epistles of St. Paul and on an altered version of the Gospel of Luke. Marcionism flourished in the West until about the 4th century. Thus, Tertullian was the voice of orthodoxy, of Orthodox Christianity. He was the most prominent voice in the cause against Marcion. Tertullian's words must have been crucial to defeat Marcionism. What was the main point of Tertullian's attack on Marcion? As we shall see, Tertullian primarily attacks Marcion for his undue reliance on Paul. Paul's apostleship is dubious, Tertullian explains. Likewise, Tertullian believed Paul was not an authority on par with the 12 apostles. I'm going to give you all these quotes in a minute. I'm just introducing it. If Paul contradicts the 12, Paul's words are not to be followed. When Tertullian wants to isolate those contradictions, Tertullian is circumspect. Tertullian finds flaws in Pauline doctrines without citing Paul as a source of Marcion's wrong ideas. So in other words, he's going to attack Marcion's views on predestination, faith alone, all that, but he's not going to say anything about Paul directly. He's indirectly criticizing Paul. And I say this: however, we can recognize Paul's words in Marcion's mouth. Another major vulnerability of Marcion exploited by Tertullian was Marcion's theological explanation why the law did not have to be followed. Marcion must have realized that Paul's claim that the law was given by angels was unsound biblically, of course. So Marcion devised what he regarded as a better reason to prove the law of Moses was invalid. What was this? Marcion had a very elaborate and well-defended view why the law was invalid, set forth in his work called The Antitheses. Marcion claimed that the God of the Old Testament could not be the God of the New. Jesus is God and the Father is God, but both are kindly and loving. Marcion sought to prove the creator God of the Old is a different type of God, mean, willing to do evil, sometimes unsure of his aims, repenting of plans or actions. Just want to pause there is when you listen to Pauline preaching and you listen to Paul, you definitely get this idea that it's advantageous to distinguish God, the Father of the law, prophets, and writings, even though Jesus endorses that God, from Jesus and his God, the Father, because ultimately they don't want to go back to the God of the law. And so they find a way to denigrate the God of the law and talk as if he doesn't know what he's doing, because that's actually what Paul's point was in Galatians when he said the law was given by angels to a mediator, Moses, in Galatians 3:19, and then he calls them weak and celestial beings. So there is this built-in denigration of the law as produced by weak and beggarly angels, and that's the way Paul handled it. But ultimately, if you can't sell that to someone that the law came from angels, because it's preposterous, it never says that. It never says the angels were the ones talking at Mount Sinai, right? It says Yahweh said this and Yahweh said that. So the only recourse you have is you have to say that Paul is saying that the God of Sinai is really a weak and beggarly being. And so that's what they ended up doing. They started arguing, and that's what he's contending. So it's not a surprise that he went this way. Then it goes on here. Yet Marcion's solution exposed him to the charge of polytheism. So because now you have, think about how many gods you now have. You have the God, the Father, who's in heaven with Jesus and Paul. You then have the God Yahweh, who the 12 are living with in Sheol, in the land of the dead, which is basically also known as hell, but I don't think Marcion is claiming they're in hell in the sense of fire and that kind of thing. But they're not living in this wonderful place in heaven with all of us. They're with this secondary God and he's not really the good God that Jesus knows and Paul knows. And the 12 are destined to be in that place. So he claimed one member of the Godhead had a distinct and different nature from the other two. So you've got the demiurge or the bad God, he's in Sheol. You've got the good God, the Father, and then Jesus is God. So you got three gods. One is in the Sheol, and two are in heaven, and one is the Father, and Jesus is the Son, but those two are God as well. Okay, so Tertullian had a field day with this claim of Marcion. The Marcionites were vigorously persecuted as heretics, but not simply for this polytheistic flaw. Tertullian, and against Marcion, relied on much more than this. Tertullian's primary defense of Christ was based on lifting up Jesus' words in the Gospels above Paul, thereby defeating the core doctrines of Marcion. Based on Tertullian's work, the apostolic churches defeated Marcionism. The Marcionites' early Paul-onlyism almost swallowed the church. Yet the early church bravely fought back and survived. Marcionism took almost 300 years to be defeated within Christianity. Now let's look at the group called the Paulicians, just so you see the history of the Marcionites continued for centuries. In fact, Marcionism, despite being crippled by the 300s, had a strong fascination for centuries thereafter. Paul-onlyism lived on within the fringe of Christianity. This was because the Marcionite churches had entered Armenia early on. They reemerged as a force in Armenia in the 8th century. Their Christian opponents labeled them Paulicians because of their adherence to Paul. Eventually, they spread to Bulgaria and Turkey. The Paulicians claimed only Paul's gospel is the true gospel. Salvation is by faith alone. The Gospels Matthew, Mark, and John had to be eliminated as canon, and there is to be selective receipt of Luke's gospel account. And I just want you to know, you see how John gets thrown in there? These people knew what I'm trying to tell everybody. If you translate Greek correctly, you would not conclude John is talking about 30 times about believing in Jesus. In Greek, you translated obey unto Jesus. And this is not a faith-alone gospel at all. It's the opposite. And we have a whole series on that, and we'll continue. This was unmistakably similar to the core doctrines of Marcion. In 844, the Paulicians took control of a state in Turkey and became a military power. In 871 AD, they were defeated by Emperor Basil I of Byzantium. The Eastern Orthodox treated the Paulicians as heretics, yet the Paulicians survived into the 12th century. See this article, Paulicians in the Catholic Encyclopedia. It mentions that they, quote, rejected the Old Testament. 2, to believe in him, Jesus saves men from judgment. 3, their Bible was a fragmentary New Testament. In N.G. Garzoian, The Paulician Heresy, 1968, it mentions, quote, the sect especially valued the Gospel of Luke and the Pauline epistles. So they're very much like Marcion, right? So that's late into the late hundreds, and they continued on to the 1200s. Thus, Marcionism remained a persistent force within Christianity from 144 AD to the 1200s. Yet in all this time, they were always viewed universally as heretics. What cannot be ignored is that in Marcionism, we have the first representatives of what today would otherwise pass as an evangelical Protestant sect. Right? I mean, Jesus is God, the Father is God. That's very much in common. And Yahweh, do the Pauline Christian churches regard Yahweh as not important, kind of a mean and angry God? That's exactly what Marcionism teaches, and doesn't look at his loving nature and all of that. So it's an unbalanced view of God and denigrates him as the author of the 5 books of Moses are really, weak and beggarly angels. So you really can't find any difference, if you ask me, between Marcionism and modern dispensational Christians. So even Marcion's view of the God of the Old versus the God of the New appears today in the repackaged form of dispensational theology. Thus, Marcion forced the early church to weigh what today passes as Pauline theology. Yet the post-apostolic church from 125 AD to 325 AD clearly rejected Marcion and his Pauline theology. Okay, so we're going to stop there. In our next episode, we're going to cover where, to answer that same question, we haven't gotten to the question yet about why did Jesus have to pick Paul? Did he make a mistake? He ascended prematurely. He should have stayed around and found this guy Paul and picked him to be the new leader for the Gentiles and so on. And instead, he waits 4 years and he picks somebody who's a blasphemer and a violent man. You can answer the question as like anyone else. So next time we're going to deal with Tertullian demonstrates Paul is inferior to the other apostles, and we'll probably have another third episode which will conclude the series. So I'm keeping this to about a 20-minute episode. Hopefully the next one will be just 20 minutes so you can fit this all in over a few days to see all 3 episodes in a matter of 20 minutes a day. Okay, God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.